The Zephyrian Empire had built its reputation on three fundamental principles: superior firepower, tactical brilliance, and the unshakable belief that physical prowess determined galactic hierarchy. For 12 centuries, this philosophy had served them well, conquering 73 systems and establishing themselves as the undisputed masters of martial excellence. Their warrior academies were legendary, their gladiatorial tournaments drew spectators from across the galaxy, and their champions were revered as living gods. Which made the current situation on planet Qeth'ma particularly amusing, though nobody was laughing yet. The Academy of Martial Supremacy squatted on Qeth'ma's crimson surface like a metallic cancer, its chrome spires piercing the perpetually stormy sky. Here, the galaxy's most promising warriors came to either achieve greatness or die trying. The mortality rate hovered around 30%, which the Zephyrians considered acceptably efficient. After all, weakness was a disease that required aggressive treatment. Inside the Academy's primary training complex, Instructor Qeth'ma adjusted his ceremonial battle harness and surveyed the morning's fresh batch of interspecies exchange students. His 4 eyes moved independently, cataloging threats with practiced efficiency. The Craxian delegation looked promising, their natural bone armor gleaming under the artificial suns. The Void Stalkers from the outer rim carried themselves with predatory grace, their retractable claws already extended in anticipation. Even the diminutive Hive Speakers showed potential, their compound eyes tracking multiple targets simultaneously. Then his gaze fell on the human. Instructor Qeth'ma had encountered many species during his 40-year career. He had trained crystalline warriors whose bodies could deflect plasma bolts, shadow dancers who could phase through solid matter, and berserker clones engineered specifically for combat effectiveness. He had never, however, encountered anything quite so unimpressive. The human female stood barely 5.5 feet tall, her pale skin unmarked by ritual scarification or natural armor plating. She possessed no visible claws, fangs, or defensive spines. Her musculature appeared adequate for basic locomotion, but laughably insufficient for serious combat. Most insulting of all, she seemed completely relaxed, as if attending a social gathering rather than the galaxy's most prestigious Death Academy. "State your designation and homeworld," Qeth'ma commanded, his translator rendering the words in perfectly neutral standard Galactic. "Kira Volkov, terra firma, Sol System," she replied with infuriating calm. "Exchange student from the Terran Combat Institute." Several alien students chuckled, a sound like grinding metal mixed with dying prey animals. The Terran Combat Institute was notorious throughout civilized space as a quaint educational facility where humans pretended to understand warfare. Their graduation requirements included such laughably primitive skills as hand-to-hand combat and tactical breathing. The Academy's admission of a Terran student was widely regarded as either a bureaucratic error or an elaborate joke. Vex'tar Bloodclaw chose this moment to make his entrance. At 9 feet of pure Zephyrian superiority, Vex'tar represented everything the galaxy feared and respected about his species. His exoskeleton bore the ritual scars of 47 victories, each mark precisely carved to indicate the method of his opponent's demise. His 4 primary arms rippled with enhanced muscle fibers, while his secondary limbs sported razor-sharp claws capable of shearing through starship hull plating. Most impressive of all was his combat record: 133 fights, 133 victories, 0 defeats. He was, in the clinical terminology favored by galactic combat statisticians, an absolute monster. Instructor Qeth'ma, Vex'tar's voice carried the subtle harmonics of barely contained violence. "I trust you're not seriously considering allowing this creature to participate in our sacred exercises." The human, Kira, glanced up at the towering champion with mild interest, as if examining a particularly large but unremarkable geological formation. This reaction, or lack thereof, seemed to perplex Vex'tar considerably. Most beings cowed appropriately when confronted with his magnificent presence. "The exchange protocols require equal participation opportunities," Qeth'ma explained with obvious reluctance. "Though I suspect the human will eliminate herself through natural selection within the first training cycle." "How wonderfully optimistic," Kira murmured, apparently to herself. The first week proceeded exactly as predicted, which is to say, not at all as anyone expected. The Academy's training regimen was designed to separate the merely competent from the genuinely lethal. Morning exercises began with gravitational conditioning at 3 times galactic standard, followed by weapons familiarization, tactical simulation, and competitive sparring. The afternoon schedule included environmental adaptation, psychological warfare theory, and the ever-popular survival or die-trying practicum. Most new students required several weeks to adapt, assuming they survived the initial shock. A few exceptional individuals managed to excel immediately, earning the grudging respect of their instructors and peers. The human, however, appeared to be conducting an entirely different experiment. She never complained about the crushing gravity, but she never seemed to struggle with it either. During weapons training, she displayed adequate competency with standard galactic armaments while showing curious interest in primitive melee weapons that most civilized species had abandoned millennia ago. Her tactical simulations were unremarkable but error-free, suggesting a methodical mind operating well within its limitations. Most puzzling of all was her behavior during sparring sessions. The human fights like she's solving a mathematical equation, observed Zix, a young nebula sprite whose species was renowned for pattern recognition. She doesn't try to win. She just studies. This observation proved remarkably accurate. When paired against opponents, Kira would engage defensively, absorbing tremendous amounts of punishment while carefully cataloging her adversary's techniques, preferences, and physical capabilities. She lost every match, but she lost them in increasingly interesting ways, as if each defeat was providing valuable data for some larger calculation. Vex'tar found this behavior insufferable. "Look at the pathetic creature," he announced during one particularly brutal sparring session. "She cannot even provide adequate entertainment for our amusement. What manner of species produces such weak, useless specimens?" Kira, who was currently being used as target practice by a Voidstalker, paused long enough to glance in his direction. "The kind that finds this educational," she replied, then promptly got launched across the training mat by a particularly enthusiastic tail swipe. By the third week, the novelty of having a human punching bag had worn thin. Even the instructors seemed embarrassed by Kira's continued presence, though academy regulations prevented them from simply eliminating her through training accidents. The other students had moved past mockery into something approaching pity, which was arguably worse. Vex'tar, however, had moved past pity into active irritation. "I propose a formal challenge," he announced during the evening meal, his voice carrying clearly across the dining complex. "Single combat, academy rules, public exhibition. I will demonstrate once and for all why humans represent the absolute nadir of galactic evolution." The dining hall fell silent. Formal challenges were serious business, governed by ancient protocols that predated the Empire itself. Once issued and accepted, they could only be resolved through combat, with the loser suffering whatever consequences the victor deemed appropriate. Given Vex'tar's record and temperament, those consequences typically prove fatal. Kira looked up from her meal, a surprisingly unappetizing mixture of nutrients designed to sustain carbon-based life forms. "Are you asking me to fight you?" "I am offering you the honor of dying at the hands of a true warrior," Vex'tar corrected with magnificent condescension. "Though I suppose even that exceeds your species' modest capabilities." Interesting proposition. Kira set down her eating utensil and considered the towering champion thoughtfully. "I accept." The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Several students choked on their food. Instructor Qeth'ma began calculating the paperwork involved in disposing of human remains. A few entrepreneurial spectators started organizing betting pools, though the odds were so heavily skewed that generating meaningful action proved difficult. "Perhaps the human doesn't understand what she's agreeing to," suggested Chancellor Vorthak, the Academy's chief administrator. The translation matrices sometimes struggle with complex concepts like certain death and complete annihilation. "Oh, I understand perfectly," Kira assured him. "Though I'm curious about one thing. When you say Academy rules, does that include the standard equipment restrictions, or are we talking about traditional Zephyrian combat protocols?" This question demonstrated an unexpected familiarity with galactic combat regulations that surprised everyone present. Academy rules permitted minimal protective gear and restricted weapons to those approved by the governing council. Traditional Zephyrian protocols, by contrast, were essentially legalized murder with ceremonial overtones. Academy rules, Vex'tar decided, apparently feeling generous. I wish my victory to be witnessed by as many species as possible, and certain governing bodies frown upon exhibitions that result in immediate casualties. How thoughtful, Kira replied. When would be convenient? 3 days later, the Academy's primary arena buzzed with unprecedented activity. Word of the challenge had spread throughout the local systems, attracting spectators, journalists, and what appeared to be several black market organs dealers hoping to capitalize on the aftermath. The betting pools had evolved into complex mathematical models, attempting to predict not whether Kira would lose, but precisely how quickly and in how many pieces. The arena itself was a masterpiece of destructive engineering, designed to contain beings capable of devastating entire city blocks during casual disagreements. Force fields, gravity manipulation systems, and emergency medical facilities surrounded a combat space large enough to accommodate even the most enthusiastic displays of violence. The walls were constructed from reinforced durasteel composites rated to withstand direct hits from heavy military ordnance. These precautions were generally considered excessive for Academy rules combat, but Zephyrian pride demanded absolute overkill in all circumstances. Vex'tar entered first, resplendent in ceremonial combat harness that highlighted every scar, enhancement, and natural weapon at his disposal. The crowd's roar shook the arena's foundations as he performed the traditional pre-combat ritual, a series of increasingly dramatic poses designed to demonstrate his readiness for glorious violence. His 4 primary arms moved in perfect synchronization, while his secondary limbs extended their claws in anticipation. Kira entered wearing standard Academy training gear and an expression of mild interest. The contrast was so stark that several spectators assumed they were witnessing some sort of elaborate performance art. The human looked like she was attending a casual athletic event, completely unaware that she was about to be systematically dismantled by one of the galaxy's most efficient killing machines. Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted lifeforms, announced the arena's master of ceremonies, today we witness a historic first, the complete and total humiliation of the human species before an audience of civilized beings. Let the record show that Terra's representative requested this demonstration of her inherent inferiority. The crowd cheered appreciatively. Several vendors moved through the stands selling refreshments and commemorative programs. A few enterprising journalists began composing obituaries. Combatants, assume ready positions, instructed the referee, a heavily armored official whose species was renowned for their ability to survive in combat zones. Remember, Academy rules apply, medical intervention will be provided when possible, and all major organs should be returned to their original owners at the conclusion of hostilities. Vex'tar dropped into his species' traditional combat stance, a flowing posture that allowed maximum flexibility while presenting minimal target area. His claws extended to their full length, each one capable of penetrating most known materials. His respiratory system shifted into combat mode, flooding his bloodstream with performance-enhancing chemicals. Every muscle fiber in his massive frame prepared for explosive action. Kira stood normally, her hands empty, her posture relaxed to the point of appearing bored. "Begin," shouted the referee, then immediately retreated to a safe distance. What followed was less a fight than a carefully choreographed demonstration of Zephyrian superiority. Vex'tar moved with liquid grace, his attacks flowing seamlessly from one devastating technique to another. He employed claw strikes that could shred starship armor, grappling maneuvers that could crush reinforced combat suits, and acrobatic sequences that defied several laws of physics. Kira spent the first 5 minutes avoiding these attacks through what appeared to be purely defensive movement. She ducked, weaved, rolled, and occasionally jumped, always maintaining just enough distance to avoid serious injury while never moving far enough to suggest she was actually trying to escape. Her expression remained one of calm interest, as if she was studying a particularly engaging textbook. "Is she even trying to fight?" wondered one spectator. "Maybe this is how humans conduct warfare," suggested another, "through advanced cowardice techniques." Vex'tar himself was beginning to show signs of frustration. His attacks were becoming more elaborate but less precise, his breathing slightly elevated despite his enhanced physiology. He had expected the human to either collapse immediately or at least provide some form of entertaining resistance. Instead, she was simply there, moving just enough to avoid death while offering no meaningful opposition. "Stand still and die with honor," he demanded, launching into a particularly spectacular combination that should have reduced his opponent to component atoms. "That seems counterproductive," Kira replied, sliding under his primary strike while simultaneously stepping around his follow-up. "Though I appreciate the suggestion." The crowd was growing restless. They had come to witness a glorious execution, not an extended chase sequence. Several spectators began demanding refunds. Others started composing strongly worded reviews for the arena's management. By the 10-minute mark, even Vex'tar's enhanced stamina was showing signs of strain. His attacks remained devastating, but they were coming in shorter bursts with longer recovery periods. The human, meanwhile, appeared to have settled into a sustainable rhythm, her movements becoming increasingly fluid and economical. "This is embarrassing," muttered Instructor Qeth'ma from his position in the academic viewing box. "The human is making our greatest champion look like an amateur." "She's not winning," Chancellor Volkov pointed out. "No, but she's not losing either. And that might be worse." It was at the 15-minute mark that Kira's behavior underwent a subtle but significant shift. Instead of purely defensive movement, she began to actively position herself in specific locations around the arena. Her circling pattern became more deliberate, her responses to Vex'tar's attacks more precisely calculated. She was, several acute observers realized, hurting him. Vex'tar, consumed by frustration and the growing certainty that his reputation was being systematically dismantled, failed to notice these tactical adjustments. He simply pressed his assault with increasing desperation, convinced that superior firepower would eventually overcome whatever sorcery the human was employing. This proved to be a significant miscalculation. At precisely the 17-minute mark, Kira made her move. It began as what appeared to be another defensive maneuver, a simple step backward to avoid Vex'tar's latest claw strike. But as she moved, her trailing foot found purchase against a section of arena flooring specifically designed to provide optimal traction. Her body rotated with mechanical precision, transferring the energy of her movement into her leading leg. Her knee drove upward, then snapped forward in a perfectly executed martial arts technique that her species had been refining for millennia. The kick connected with Vex'tar's center mass, with approximately 4,000 pounds of focused kinetic energy. The Zephyrian champion, all 9 feet and 800 pounds of him, achieved unassisted flight. He traveled backward through the air in a graceful arc that would have been aesthetically pleasing under different circumstances. His trajectory carried him past the combat zone's outer markers, over the first row of spectator seating, and directly into the arena's reinforced outer wall. The impact was significant. Durasteel composite paneling, rated to withstand military-grade explosives, crumpled like decorative foil. Support structures groaned and buckled. Several emergency systems activated simultaneously, flooding the area with warning signals and automated safety announcements. A section of wall large enough to accommodate a small spacecraft simply ceased to exist, leaving a Vex'tar-shaped hole that opened directly onto the Academy's main courtyard. In the sudden silence that followed, the only sound was the gentle tinkling of falling debris. Kira lowered her leg and dusted off her hands, apparently satisfied with the results of her experiment. Around the arena, several thousand beings sat in stunned silence, their brains struggling to process what they had just witnessed. The mathematical impossibility of a 120-pound human launching an 800-pound Zephyrian through a reinforced wall defied several fundamental laws of physics, biology, and common sense. Medical team to Sector 7 announced the arena's automated systems with admirable composure. Structural engineering team to Sector 7. Possibly a priest to Sector 7. Through the hole in the wall, they could see Vex'tar's motionless form embedded in the Academy's ornamental sculpture garden, surrounded by the scattered remains of what had once been a statue commemorating Zephyrian martial supremacy. He appeared to be breathing, which was encouraging. He also appeared to be completely unconscious, which was probably for the best. Winner by The referee consulted his rule book frantically. Winner by creative interpretation of Academy combat protocols. The human, Kira Volkov. The crowd's reaction was immediate and varied. Some spectators cheered, though they seemed uncertain why. Others sat in silent contemplation, reconsidering fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. A few enterprising individuals began calculating the implications for their betting pools and promptly fainted. Kira walked to the edge of the combat zone and bowed politely to the audience. "Thank you for your attention," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed arena. "That was quite educational." As medical teams swarmed toward the crater formerly occupied by the Academy's champion, and as structural engineers began assessing the damage to what had been considered an impregnable facility, the galaxy's representatives began to understand that they might need to revise certain assumptions about human capabilities. In the academic viewing box, Chancellor Vorthak turned to Instructor Qeth'ma with an expression of profound bewilderment. "How is that possible? Humans are supposed to be weak, primitive, technologically inferior." "Perhaps," Qeth'ma replied thoughtfully, "we've been defining weak incorrectly." Down in the arena, Kira was being interviewed by a swarm of journalists, all desperately trying to understand what they had just witnessed. "Miss Volkov," called out a reporter from the Galactic Combat Network, "can you explain how you achieved such devastating results against a vastly superior opponent?" "Basic biomechanics," Kira replied with a shrug. "Leverage, timing, and approximately 15 years of martial arts training. Also, he was kind enough to position himself exactly where I needed him." "But the physics," protested another journalist. "The energy transfer ratios alone should have been impossible." "Nothing impossible about it," Kira corrected gently. "Humans have been kicking things for quite a while now. We've gotten reasonably good at it." As the interviews continued and the cleanup crews arrived, word of the match began spreading across the galaxy's communication networks. Within hours, every civilized world would know that a human female had defeated the Zephyrian Empire's greatest champion, using nothing more than a well-placed kick and some basic physics. The implications were staggering. Military strategists would spend months recalculating threat assessments. Diplomatic corps would scramble to establish better relations with the previously ignored Terran Federation. Combat academies would quietly begin researching human martial arts techniques. And throughout the galaxy, members of various species would look at their human neighbors with newfound respect and perhaps just a touch of healthy fear. 3 hours later, as the last of the debris was cleared away and Vex'tar was loaded onto a medical transport bound for the galaxy's finest rehabilitation facility, Kira sat in the Academy's administrative office, filling out post-combat paperwork. The forms were surprisingly extensive, covering everything from technique documentation to property damage assessments. "Miss Volkov," Chancellor Vorthak ventured carefully, "might I ask why you spent 3 weeks allowing yourself to be, well, beaten senseless, if you possessed these capabilities all along?" Kira looked up from her paperwork and smiled. "I was gathering data. Combat effectiveness, reaction patterns, physiological limitations. You can't develop an effective strategy without understanding your opposition. So you were studying us the entire time." "Of course. That's what exchange programs are for, right? Cultural learning, skill development, broadening perspectives." She returned to her forms with bureaucratic efficiency. "Though I do apologize about the wall. I may have slightly miscalculated the force transfer ratios." In the end, the Academy of Martial Supremacy would recover from both the structural damage and the philosophical crisis that followed. The hole in the wall would be repaired, though it would take considerably longer to repair the hole in Zephyrian confidence. Vex'tar would eventually regain consciousness and, after several months of intensive therapy, would retire from competitive combat to pursue a quieter career in diplomatic security. And throughout the galaxy, the story would be told and retold of the day a human female taught the universe's greatest warriors that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one you underestimate. After all, humans had been kicking things for a very long time indeed. They had simply been polite enough not to mention it until absolutely necessary. As for Kira Volkov, she would complete her exchange program with distinction, graduate with honors from the Academy of Martial Supremacy, and return to Terra with a comprehensive understanding of galactic combat techniques. She would also carry with her the quiet satisfaction of having introduced the wider universe to a simple but important concept. Never assume the small, quiet ones aren't paying attention. They might just be calculating the optimal trajectory for your flight through the nearest wall.